Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome to this joint venture talk with Microsoft PAC and Microsoft Research. Given the topic today, welcoming back Stephen Johnson, who's spoken to Microsoft Research many times, but talking about a topic that would also resonate really well with PAC members, we felt like this was a good opportunity to sort of bring the two groups together. So thank you, everyone, for the different time for the research folks, but the different venue for the PAC folks. You all figured it out, so thank you. And congratulations on the Windows 8 launch. So we're here today to welcome Stephen Johnson. He is the author of 7 bestsellers, including Where Good Ideas Come From and Everything Bad is Good for You, along with many others. He writes for a variety of publications, including Time, Wired, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, and has founded several influential websites, most recently Outside.in. He's here today to talk about his latest book, Future Perfect, which is very timely here in the election season, and hopefully will give us all a bit more optimism as we walk out today and face the next 2 weeks of news and things like that. So thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome, Stephen Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I feel like, given everything that's going on today in this company, it's nice to see so many people here. I would like to play with the Surface. Please, someone bring me one. I want to check it out. I haven't touched one yet. It's awesome to be back at Microsoft. This is the only organization in the world where I have spoken about all 8 of my books. You guys have been so supportive from the very beginning. I even wrote about this building in the last book as a way of thanking you. I said nice things about it. And so it's great to be back. I want to tell you, with our time together, and then we can open it up for some conversation, but I want to tell you a little bit about the argument of this book. This book is an upbeat polemic. It's trying to persuade you of something in a way of kind of viewing the world. And so I'm going to walk through that argument and tell you a few of the stories in the book. But I want to tell you just this one funny thing about the book that has never happened to me before. There's kind of a preface in this one at the beginning about progress. It's called Progress, actually. And it's in large part about the fact that we have a strange kind of bias in I think in our brains, but particularly in the media, where we're not very interested in stories of slow, incremental progress. So stories about things that have improved by 1% or 2% a year are staggeringly boring, right? That's the least interesting news story you can possibly imagine. The great new breakthrough, the new Windows 8, the new Surface, or the terrible catastrophic thing, that gets you're guaranteed headlines with that kind of news. And for some reason, we're also more interested in stories of slow and steady decline. If you write an op-ed saying that things are just getting slowly worse and worse, people really like to run stories like that. But stories about things getting slowly better are almost never covered. And this is a misguided thing because, in fact, most progress takes the shape of that slow incremental advance, which, when it goes on for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, stacks up into major, sometimes orders of magnitude improvement in our lives, but we don't hear about it enough, which gives us a kind of a skewed sense of how we're doing as a society. In fact, in this opening chapter, I have this long kind of social studies quiz, which is basically like a survey of what do you think the last 20 years kind of trend lines are for the following 15 things. And it's divorce rates, it's violent crime, it's teenage pregnancies, it's drug use, it's drunk driving, traffic fatalities, just a whole long list of things. And all of them are positive. All of them are trending, some of them more than 20 or even in some cases more than 50% over that period. But there's no incredible breakthrough, so we don't hear about it. It's just lots of people tinkering with the system in small ways. Some of them in the private sector, some of them in the public sector, some of them in the nonprofit, some of them governments. Some of it just word of mouth, improving our lives and our standards of living in all these kind of subtle ways. So all of which is to say, as an example of that, there's kind of a set piece at the beginning of the book about aviation safety, right? One of the great success stories of modern life. It is staggeringly safe to fly in a commercial airplane, right? It was safe when I was a kid. Now it's far, far, far safer. And I go through a bunch of different ways to try and visualize this. But one of the things I do is to say, over the last 20 years, if planes had gotten as fast as they have gotten safe, it would now take 5 minutes to fly from New York to Paris, right? That's the improvement in aviation safety. It's an amazing thing. So I tell you all of this to tell you this story about when my book, the final copies were done. I was on vacation. This is in August, and so I was at the beach, and they shipped up 4 copies that arrived in all their day-glow orange splendor. And I have a 10-year-old son, and for the first time he said, "Dad, I want to read your book." And so we're sitting at our little beach house, and he picks it up and starts reading through the book. And he asked me about a couple of the words, but he seems to be, understanding it, and it's all kind of cool. And at a certain point, about 20 minutes into it, he says, "Hey, Dad, how close are London and Paris?" And I'm like, "Oh, they're pretty close." And he's like, "So what, it takes like an hour to fly between them?" And I'm like, yeah, that's about right. And he says, "So in this little section here, shouldn't it be much faster than 5 minutes to fly from London to Paris?" And I said, no, it says from New York to Paris." And he says, "No, it says from London to Paris." And I go and I look at the book, and sure enough, it says from London to Paris. And I go back and look at the original manuscript that I wrote, and it says from London to Paris. And I just thought somehow in my head I was saying New York to Paris. I probably read that paragraph 20 times. My editor read it. My wife read it. 10 other people read the book in draft form. Nobody noticed that the numbers were kind of off for New York from Paris to London. And so I tell you this for 2 reasons. One, this is still the first printing, so the book is flawed. that error remains on page whatever, and I hope you accept my apologies in advance for that. But the second one is a life lesson thing, which is that the window of time from when your children are old enough to read your book to when they're old enough to fact-check your book is apparently about 15 minutes. So cherish those minutes. They just fly by if you get in that same situation. Anyway, but the main part of the book after the preface is really an argument about what I see as a new vision of progress and of change and of politics, really, that I have kind of slowly but steadily seen emerging all around me, and all these people and projects and organizations that are doing really interesting things that all seem to share a common sensibility that didn't easily fit the existing kind of vocabulary or definitions of politics as we know it. And they were all very encouraging in what they were doing. And so I decided to write this book, and it's a short little punchy book, deliberately not meant to be comprehensive, and in some ways it's a book about something that hasn't happened yet. It's a book about a movement that's just getting started. But to do it in order to kind of give this sensibility and these various different projects some unified definition or connection. So the argument of the book really, it ultimately kind of comes down to kind of 4 steps. So let me just kind of walk you through the steps and see if this makes any sense to you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear other examples of this or your own observations, because I'm still collecting ideas for this. Very much, in some sense, a work in progress, even though the book is done, despite its one mistake. So the first stage of the argument is this. We have agreed, for the most part as a society, that there are certain institutions, certain ways of organizing people that it's useful for us to have a word for, even though the specific instances of each institution or each organization are always a little bit different. There's a kind of messiness in the details. But we agree that we can talk about government. We can talk about the market. We can talk about corporations. We can talk about public sector, private sector. We can talk about these kinds of institutions, the state versus the market, even though every government is a little bit different, and every corporation is a little different. Markets have different ways of interacting. But it's useful enough for us to be able to kind of point to these things so that we don't have to get into the weeds every time we talk about a government, specifying exactly what kind it is and what flavor it is. And indeed, most of our basic kind of political values, and in fact most of what we've seen particularly in the first two debates, are about the relative kind of ratio that we think is proper to have in society, right? People on the left think that we want to have a stronger government. We think that the government should be there to build infrastructure, to provide a safety net, or to kind of rein in the excesses of the market. And the people on the right, particularly the libertarian right, want the market to be kind of unleashed, to do its work, and to have the government get out of its way. That's a big part of our, when you ask people, where do you fit on the political spectrum, one of the key ways that they think about it is the kind of ratio, the balancing act between those two big institutions. So the first rung of this argument is that there is another kind of organization that is out there, that has been out there for a very long time, but that we have new understanding of and new technology that allows us to kind of amplify the power of this organization. And that it deserves to have a place in that spectrum. And that there are a growing number of people who really believe in this particular kind of organization and think that in some ways it may be better than the poles of the market and the state. And that organization is what I'm calling the peer network, kind of borrowing the language of technology, a peer-to-peer network. So a peer network is a group of people decentralized without traditional kind of leadership, top-down structures. For those of you who read my book Emergence many years ago, this is an idea that was first incubating in my head then when I was writing about decentralized systems in ant colonies and city neighborhoods and so on. So it's a system that is decentralized in its control structure. It is diverse in its perspectives. The diversity is a key value of these systems. They aren't an echo chamber where everybody is thinking similarly. It brings a lot of different kind of sometimes professional perspectives to bear on a problem. It involves some kind of measure of some mechanism for rewarding good ideas or amplifying good ideas, but also it doesn't traditionally have traditional economic relations in many cases, so you don't have ownership over these ideas, so that it's easy to kind of build on top of other people's ideas or improve on them. So it is this kind of open network of collaboration, right? Now, since I was last here, I think, I have moved from New York to Northern California. And if we'd been having this conversation 40 years ago, and I got in front of you and said, there's a new form of open collaboration without traditional ownership, and people come together and share ideas and freely build on top of their ideas, you would have said, I'm sure life is going well for you in your commune in Mendocino, weaving baskets or whatever you're doing there. But the truth is, in reality, you need either big states or big corporations to make things happen. But now, 40 years later, we have the history of the internet and the web and of Wikipedia and of open source and all these projects where people have come together, sometimes with visionary early government funding, and sometimes with contributions, important contributions from the private sector and companies like Microsoft. But in many cases, we have these success stories of entities that exist and have been so successful precisely because nobody owns them. Precisely because everybody's contributing a small amount to the system, and because they're open and collaborative environments where people can build on top of other people's ideas, right? So we can, I have this kind of thought experiment that I wrote about in the Times Magazine just to give some sense of like how dependent we are, because I don't think people realize this. If you were some kind of like Dr. Evil and you could build a magnetic pulse device that would, kind of shut down every piece of kind of peer network or peer produced software in the world, this room, I don't have to explain what would happen. All the things that would go dark, starting with the internet itself. And what a devastating thing that would be a global catastrophe, right? Markets would go down, energy infrastructure would go down, people's lives would be heavily disrupted. And thankfully, you can't build such a device, but it shows how dependent both the markets and the state have become on peer network collaboration. Right? They've created these platforms that then the private sector and the public sector can build upon in all these interesting ways. So the point here, the kind of first rung of the argument is that it's not that, and I spent a lot of time in this book trying to make it clear that this is not a cyber utopian argument. This is not about technology being our salvation, right? This is not about, if we could just get everybody on Facebook, the world will be better. It's like people should maybe spend a little less time on Facebook, right? It's rather the idea that we can now point to the way that these open networks were kind of built as a role model, not necessarily just as a tool, but as an example that we can point to and say, this is not some utopian fantasy. This is something that actually has worked in the real world, right? So that's part one, that there is this organizational form of the peer network that is meaningful and gets and builds things. It's not just some kind of naive fantasy. The next step is that you can use peer networks to solve problems that aren't necessarily technological in nature. And the best example of this, which all of you I'm sure are familiar with in the last few years, is Kickstarter. Actually, it's been interesting as I'm touring around the country talking about this book, how in a non-tech savvy audience, actually how many people have heard of Kickstarter. It's really become a big deal, almost seemingly over the course of this book tour. It's amazing how more and more people seem to have heard about it. But Kickstarter is an example of taking a peer network to solve a different kind of problem, which is the problem of how do you fund creative ideas that don't yet have traditional backing from the market, right? So if you're a musician and you're trying to finish your album, but you don't yet have a record deal, what do? We've agreed as a society, most of us, that it's worth it for us to figure out ways to fund creative ideas that aren't yet supported by the marketplace. That in the long run, that's healthy. One, some of those ideas become financially viable on their own. In other ways, we just think it's good for society to have people pushing the envelope of creativity for a whole host of other kind of less tangible reasons. And so we have institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts. We don't have a National Endowment for detergents because we've decided as a society that the market is doing great at giving us infinite variety of detergents. So but we've built up philanthropic organizations or state organizations to support the arts. Well, Kickstarter came along and said, okay, those things are great, but the world is probably filled with far more people who would be willing to give $10 or $50 or $100 to support a creative work just because they want to see it in the world. And they kind of unlocked all this interesting kind of demand, and they created a very interesting kind of gift economy, right? With Kickstarter, the economics of it are funny, right? You get rewards, and a lot of the creativity of Kickstarter is built into the reward system. So it's $10, I'll give you a signed copy of the CD. $100, and I'll come to your house and serenade you with my acoustic guitar. You can create these different kind of layers. But most of the time, in traditional economic terms, people are vastly overpaying for things, particularly since they're paying for things that don't exist yet, right? By definition, in Kickstarter, if you're giving money, the thing that you're buying hasn't been built yet, right? And there's no investment structure here. It is by law not an investment vehicle, right? So if you back that musician and they go on to have a #1 Billboard record, you see no upside, right? There's no return on investment in a traditional way in that kind of exchange. And yet Kickstarter, interestingly, is itself a for-profit company, right? It's a venture-backed startup, like the very apex of modern capitalism. But what it creates is this kind of gift economy, this crowdfunding gift economy, where people are contributing in part because they want the thing they're paying for, but they're overpaying because they want to help the artist and they want the feeling of participating and helping things that they think the world should have, and being seen helping. And there's a social kind of dynamic as well to it. People are always talking about how they back this or that on Twitter or Facebook, right? And so in a strange way, it's this bizarre thing where like this venture-backed startup creates as its product a kind of gift economy as its output. It would be like some 19th century factory that creates a socialist collective as its product. It's a bizarre concept, right? And again, this is one of these things, you all know this, I'm sure, where 5 years ago we would have all said, well, that's a lovely idea, but it's not really going to work in practice. I kind of doubt, right? And now, of course, Kickstarter this year is on track to give away more money than the entire budget of the National Endowment for the Arts, right? And it's 3 or 4 years old, right? So the question is now, could it be 10 times the size of the NEA? Not whether it could ever rival the NEA. So that's a peer network that is unlocking all this demand. Now, I do not mean to suggest that we should then do away with the NEA. I mean, I adapted the book for the Wall Street Journal at one point. We did a lot of excerpts of the book in different places, and one place was the Wall Street Journal. And I was talking about Kickstarter in the article, and they kept saying, yeah, I think our readers would like to know how peer networks can be used to eliminate funding for the NEA. I think that would be really good. And I was like, well, that's not really my point here. It's not that we want to replace those state institutions. The state institutions may be fine. It may be that we want to make the NEA a little bit more like Kickstarter, for instance. Or maybe that the NEA starts to have kind of matching grants that can work alongside Kickstarter donations, or any number of things. But it's not that I'm saying let's get rid of these state institutions and replace them entirely with peer networks. But that they now can have rivals in that peer network architecture in the case of crowdfunding art is pretty impressive. So that's rung 2 of the argument. Rung 3 is this, that we don't even necessarily need technology to form these kinds of networks of collaboration. Next week, actually, I'm going to be going to the town of Porto Alegre in Brazil. And about 23, 24 years ago, Porto Alegre was this kind of classic developing world city that had gone from 200,000 people to 2 million people in a shockingly short amount of time. And it had all the usual infrastructure problems that a city like that has. The sewer lines weren't extended, the electrical grid wasn't extended to all these places. You had these shanty towns, the favelas, where people were living in kind of improvised communities, and there was tremendous waste and corruption and all that kind of stuff. And so in this really interesting move, the city decided to experiment with this thing that in translation is called participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting is basically a peer network, but it's a peer network that works without really any technology in its original form. So the idea is this. Every year, there is a significant slice of taxpayer dollars that gets set aside for neighborhoods all over the city to specifically kind of earmark the funds for specific projects. So neighborhoods get together, they have these kind of council meetings where they all, just members of the community get together, and they have these public discussions where they talk about what are the needs in that neighborhood. We need the sewer line extended here, we need this road paved, we need another room in the schoolhouse, we need a community garden here, we need a playground here. And through these discussions, the neighbors come up with a ranked list of priorities for the school, for the community, that they submit to the city. And the city then kind of doles out the money based on those specific asks, basically, with a slight skew towards the poorer parts of the neighborhood. So there's a little bit of redistribution from the wealthier neighborhoods that are paying the taxes to the ones that aren't. The money is still, again, the money is coming from the state. This is not a 1,000 points of light, let the state stop working because charity organizations will take over. This is still taxpayer dollars funding things. But the decision of what to fund is coming from the street, from the folks who live in these communities. And this is one of the reasons why this kind of peer network strategy, I think, in terms of politics, is already working and is going to be incredibly powerful on that local level. Because when you talk about people's neighborhoods, the true experts in a neighborhood are the people who live there, right? Yeah?
Is it a little bit what it's doing in New York through open plans?
Yeah. So I'll get to that. I'm headed that direction. That's exactly right. So you're able to basically, you know what the needs are. And so every community has all this, kind of untapped expertise that's happening there kind of on a ground level, that if you give people the right tools, they can actually contribute. Sometimes those tools are high-tech, sometimes they're not. In Porto Alegre, what they found was that the whole system got much more efficient. And it got much more efficient for a couple of reasons. The first one was it was so much harder for dollars to disappear. So when, some bureaucrat somewhere earmarks, $5 million for sewer repair, but no one ever really hears about it, and in fact the sewer doesn't get repaired and the $5 million goes to build someone's villa, it's just the accountability is harder there because nobody really knew about the project in the first place. But what they found in Porto Alegre is because people were like, hey, hold on, we asked for that sewer extension, where is it? So things got built and the whole system became more responsive, and then it created this positive feedback loop where people had showed up at a council meeting, asked for something, and whoa, 5 months later, there it was. And so they came back for more. And it's been a huge success, and it's now spreading. It's actually they're experimenting with specifically participatory budgeting in Brooklyn and in Chicago, and it's in more than 10% of European cities and towns. But again, this is 1989 in Brazil. There's no smartphones. There's barely any internet. It's not a technological. The platform is human beings getting together face to face in a room. But it's still that peer network. It's a network of neighbors kind of collaborating and solving problems. There's another example that's not in the book, which you all probably know about because it's close to here. There's a great story that I stumbled across just in the last couple of weeks about this guy, Mark Lakeman, who lived in Portland. And he lived in this residential community in Portland. And it was just, ordinary kind of residential street. And he went off on a trip to Central America, and he came back and he was kind of looking at this intersection that he lived at the corner of, and he said, Jesus, this is such a dead space. It's just the cars kind of own it. Nothing ever happens here. But if you go back to these traditional cultures and you see that crossroads are where kind of civic life happens. So two roads intersect. That's where people gather, and that's where kind of communities form. They're kind of sacred spaces in a funny way, and kind of neighborhoods and communities. And so he thought, how can I capture some of that in my own, kind of banal, anonymous intersection in front of my house? And so he went to all of his neighbors and he said, I really want to paint our intersection. I want to create a big, elaborate, kind of intersection-wide, somewhat psychedelic-looking painting, just to give it some identity. I think it'd be really cool. And so he got all of his neighbors, his peers, kind of to come around to this idea. And then he goes to the city, he goes to the Department of Transportation, and they have this beautiful Orwellian moment where they say, you can't do that, that's public space, no one can use it, which is pretty nice. But eventually, actually, the mayor got word of it and kind of liked the idea, so he got approval to do it. And then, all these things started to pop up around it. So, there was like a community lending library was set up there where people could bring books and share books. And then somebody created, because this is Portland, they created a 24-hour solar-powered tea station where you could go and have some tea. Gotta love it. And then other intersections around Portland started saying, hey, that's really cool, I want to do that too. So they created this thing, they call it intersection repair. And now there are intersections like this in Seattle and in a bunch of other places. And it's created this organization now called City Repair. And what's great about it is, again, this is not, they didn't create that identity by going to the state. In fact, the city tried to shut them down initially. And they didn't go to Starbucks and say, could you build a coffee shop here so that we have some community here, right? It was coming from the neighbors themselves in this kind of bottom-up way. So, and again, the most advanced technology was the paint, really. It wasn't, I mean, I suppose once they put the solar-powered tea station, that was more advanced. But mostly it was a very kind of low-tech affair. So that's the third rung, that peer networks, particularly on a local level, are a great kind of powerful mechanism for improving our lives and making decisions that sometimes are much better off and more responsive than the ones that we make in the private sector or through governments. So the fourth rung of the argument is this. If you buy that, that peer networks are an important organizational force, we should understand more, we should explore more, they should be part of that kind of ratio that I was talking about at the beginning, and maybe some of us might be strong enough to say that our default assumption should be to try and build peer networks where we can, to make governments more like peer networks, in some sense to make corporations internally, the architecture of corporations, to make them more like peer networks. If you believe in that, where are you on the political spectrum? What is your natural home in kind of the left and the right and the two-party system we have in this country? And I would argue that there isn't really a natural home, because of a couple of reasons. The first reason is this. If you believe in the power of peer networks, you do fundamentally believe in the power of decentralized decision-making. And in that sense, you take seriously the kind of libertarian idea that comes from Hayek and the Austrian school, that decentralized systems, in the libertarian argument, marketplaces, will in the long run outperform and out-innovate and be more responsive and resilient than centrally planned top-down systems. So the libertarian argument has always been the world is too complex, the market is too complex, the economy is too complex for a small elite group of planners to figure it all out. And every time a small elite group of planners tries to figure out this complex thing, the planned economies fail because they have to compress down all that data through this little bottleneck of kind of 10 minds or 100 minds. And all the nuance and subtlety and complexity of the thing itself gets kind of rendered into this caricature, and so the planning fails because it doesn't understand the totality of the thing it's trying to plan. And so what markets do is kind of break up all that knowledge into millions or hundreds of millions of individual people, not one of whom, if I get my grammar right there, understands the economy in its totality. All they have to focus on is the thing they're making, the thing they're selling, the thing they're consuming, the thing they're buying. But out of all those collective decisions, all those individual decisions, a larger kind of collective pattern, this is the kind of invisible hand. So if you believe in peer networks, there's a part of that argument that you buy, right? You believe in the power of decentralization. You believe in the resilience and the innovation of decentralized systems. The part you don't buy is that the only version of that is a market. The only version of that is the private sector. And what a lot of the people that I write about in the book, that I think what defines them is they believe in decentralization, but they also believe that markets have limits and that there are things that markets don't do very well. And there are things that in fact other kinds of systems do better than the private sector. And that while the market is incredibly powerful at lots of things, there are a whole host of parts of human experience that are not particularly well served by markets, or where markets are just kind of indifferent. And so we need other institutions. In the past, that was a vacuum that was filled by big governments and by the state. But this new sensibility says, no, there are other forms of decentralization. Actually, Hayek, famously called a market a system of telecommunications. That's what he talked about. He used this kind of technological communications theory language to talk about how markets work. But the irony is, when it came time to build the global systems of telecommunication that connect all the minds on the earth in the form of the internet and the web, it turned out that actually, while markets played a role and governments played a role, it turned out that the ultimate solution that bound us all together actually came from somewhere outside the market. And it was better off to build a system that no individual corporation owned than it was to build something inside a private sector entity, right? So that's kind of the irony of Hayek's original ideas, or at least the metaphor he used. But on the other hand, while you may say that the market has its limits, on the other hand, you're not a big champion of top-down big institutions and big governments. You're trying to make governments more bottom-up as well. So in trying to figure out where you are on the political spectrum, it's tricky if you believe in these things. And so I've tried to kind of reach for a word or a kind of a term, an umbrella category for these people who share these values. And I knew early on that peer was a key word here. It's a lovely word. It plays both in the tech world and the low-tech world, right? The jury of our peers, the respect of our peers, peer review in academic world. And I started calling these people, because some of them come out of the traditional progressive tradition, and because fundamentally they believe in progress. They have this kind of optimistic assessment of the world that they think that positive change is possible. So I started calling these people peer progressives. That's the kind of umbrella term. Whether that sticks or not, I think there's value in seeing them as a group and having that shorthand ability to say, well, if we applied a peer network, how would it work here? Or what would a peer progressive take be? That just, there's a certain kind of economy and efficiency in having terms that we can point to and use. And that's what I'm kind of trying to do with this book. And I'll give you one example of this, which I think was really interesting and wasn't fully understood at the time, which was the battle against the Stop Online Privacy Act, SOPA. And this is a really interesting case study where you had this major attempt to kind of rein in the decentralized structure of the internet, probably one of the single kind of biggest attempts by both kind of states and corporations to rein in the internet. However you feel about the actual bill, what was striking about it initially was, here we live in this terrible hyper-partisan gridlocked political situation. The bipartisan support for SOPA was unbelievable. I mean, you would have thought this bill was a support your troops initiative, right? I mean, the one thing that both parties can agree on is that too many people are downloading music illegally, right? That was the flag that both parties could rally around, right? And so this thing was sailing through the House and the Senate, right? SOPA and PIPA, right? They were it was absolutely going to pass. And then this weird thing happened, right? The network became self-aware, right? This strange thing, people started posting things on Reddit and Boing Boing, and blog posts started to appear. And it built up until all of a sudden there was this kind of historic blackout day. Wikipedia went dark, all these other sites went dark. And within 2 days, the bill was dead in the water. Now, what I think was really interesting about it, whether you think that was a good idea or a bad idea, what was so interesting about it was the way it was covered in the media. Because the media wants to, everything is the horse race, right? Everything is like, all right, something just happened. What does it mean for the score? Was this good for the Democrats or good for the Republicans? Victory for Obama, victory for Bonner? Who's winning? Who's up? Who's down? And here you had this bill, and they couldn't figure out how to score it. They were like, okay, it was defeated because it was because Chris Dodd was a Democrat, so it must be a lot. But wait a second, it was backed by all these Republicans. Who defeated this thing? And what I think it really was is, in some ways, it was this the kind of the first kind of sound of the pure progressive sensibility. It was like the silent nerd majority out there. That was all these people who fundamentally felt that the decentralized structure of the internet was one of the best things that we'd come up with as a species in the last 30 years, and that big top-down institutions shouldn't mess with it lightly. But that group, that sensibility, doesn't have a natural home in either party. And so when they started to kind of raise their tentacles, I mean really handsome tentacles, the traditional media couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Like, who are these people? What's going on? Now, that was a case of that power, that kind of decentralized movement being used to kind of stop something. What I've tried to do in this book is talk about all the other experiments and projects and initiatives that are out there trying to start something, trying to build things. Whether it's Kickstarter, whether it's open plans like projects that are actually out there and making the world actually better, not just kind of standing in the way of things. And I'll give you just one last example, maybe my favorite story from the book, which is an incredible example, kind of a hybrid peer network model, which is 311. The 311 service in many cities, probably, is 311 in Seattle? I don't know. Okay, so 311, it's in lots of cities. In New York, they have kind of the finest version of it. Brainchild of our entrepreneurial mayor, Michael Bloomberg. And what 311 does is a couple things. It's a number you can call to report problems or ask questions. You're guaranteed a live human being on the phone within 30 seconds. They speak over 180 different languages. Not just one person, but lots of different people speak different languages. And they have one really fluent person who answers the phone. And they, you can call in and you can say, there's a pothole on my street. It hasn't been filled for 2 months. There is a bar down the street that's making too much noise. It's 2 in the morning. Is it alternate side parking today? Are schools closed? I need to recycle my air conditioner. Where do I do it? I need a battered women's shelter. I need children's events in Prospect Park. Are there any today? And it turns out they've done this analysis, and you know how this works. 95% of the calls are about a finite number of questions, and so they can just preload all the operators with the answers. And for that 5% that aren't in that short list, they're instructed which departments will have the answers. It's a huge success. Over 100 million calls since they started in, I think, 2003. They did a survey of consumer satisfaction and comparing it to other call center programs in both the public sector and private sector. And it tied for first with high-end hotel and retail chains. With the IRS was kind of in the middle in the ranking, and at the very bottom were the cable companies. Right, not surprising. But think about that. This is a government agency call center that is coming out #1 in terms of customer satisfaction, right? That is crazy. Have you been to the DMV recently? People don't come out of there being like, that was so satisfying. I really had a good time. Thank you so much for your responsive behavior. But here's what makes it a peer network. Here's what makes it so radical, is that it's a two-way system. So you call in and you get an answer, but the city takes in all this information and is geotagging and tagging and organizing every single call that comes in. And they use it to create this kind of real-time dashboard that shows everything that's happening in the city. They're, in a sense, using it to solve this great information overload problem of trying to figure out where the problems are in a city of 8 million people. And the old way of doing it is to say, all right, we're going to hire a lot of people, put a lot of people on our pay. We're going to hire a team of pothole inspectors who are going to go around from block to block and find the potholes and report them, and we'll go and fix them. What 311 said is, let's deputize anyone who can dial 3 numbers on a phone to be part of this process. And to do it in their own selfish interest. So they're calling in to say, I need this. But the city takes that in and says, okay, here's a need. How many other needs are like that in this particular neighborhood? Maybe there's something we need to do there. And they can learn and adapt and be much more responsive because they've decentralized and diversified the voices that are talking to them. They've suddenly given everybody this little megaphone to talk back to the city. And my favorite example of this is, which I experienced firsthand, there was this bizarre thing that happened in New York when I was still living there that would happen on the west side of Manhattan by the river, where every now and then, starting around 2004, a neighborhood would smell overwhelmingly like maple syrup. So you'd be walking down the streets in like Chelsea and you'd be like, pancakes, what is it? It smells like pancakes. And you keep walking for like 3 blocks and you're like, it still smells like pancakes. That's really odd. And so this is, New York after 9/11, So there's a strange smell saturating a neighborhood. People are nervous. They're like, is this a chemical attack from like the Aunt Jemima wing of Al-Qaeda? And so they're calling in. So literally 311 starts getting these calls that are like, it smells like syrup in Chelsea. And people are like, there's a crazy person on the phone, I know. But they kept getting the calls. And so they sent out some city official to test the air and found out it was fine. And so they instructed the operators to just let people know that the smells were nice smells and they should enjoy them, and it wasn't a big deal. But it kept happening. And a month would pass and then it would erupt somewhere else. And the Times wrote about it and local bloggers wrote about it. Nobody could figure it out. And it became so common that inside of 311, the city began officially referring to them as maple syrup events, capital M, capital S, capital E, which is like the worst Hollywood thriller you've ever gone to, like the maple syrup event. And so it went on for like 4 or 5 years, or 3 or 4 years. And finally, somebody inside the city said, hey, wait a second. These calls, we've been tracking them all this time. They're clues, right? We know the day they called. We know exactly where they were. Let's figure out. Let's go back and look at all these outbreaks. And so they aggregated all the data and they looked at the wind conditions for each day. And when you looked at all the outbreaks, they weren't all in the same neighborhood. But when you looked at the wind patterns for each day and you analyzed everything, it created this very clear vector that pointed back to this specific spot in New Jersey. The smells were coming from New Jersey. Nice smells. Nothing against New Jersey. And so they literally got in their van and drove over the bridge and went to this spot in New Jersey where they found this kind of industrial plant that processed kind of artificial flavor and smell things. And every now and then they processed the fenugreek seed, which is used in artificial maple syrup, kind of cheap maple syrup knockoffs. So they solved the mystery. Now look, it was not a chemical attack, right? It was not thank God, it was not a life or death matter. But what I love about this story is when they were designing 311, nobody said, we should make sure the system can identify syrupy smells when they erupt and locate their source, right? It was not part of the spec for the software. But because it was built on a peer network, a diverse, decentralized network where anybody could call in with a potential problem and where that information could be aggregated and analyzed and where patterns could be detected in it, the software turned out to be great at solving this mystery, even though it was not at all part of the initial kind of planning of its creators. And that's the power of these kinds of networks, is that they end up solving all these problems that their creators never dreamed of. And in a way, that's how I feel about this book. Right? This is a book, as I said, that's about something that hasn't really fully happened yet. Right? It's about the beginning of something. It's not comprehensive. There are a whole host of kind of questions I have about the extent and the limits and the capabilities of these kinds of solutions. But I wrote it, and I wrote it quickly, and I wrote it to get it out there because the time was right for it, and because I wanted to amplify the people and the organizations that I write about the book and kind of push it forward. And my hope is, and this has happened with a couple of my books, that 5 years from now, I'll look back and some folks who read part of it were inspired by some of the stories in it will have gone on to create things that I never dreamed about, that solve problems that maybe that I didn't even think peer networks could solve. And so, if you get a chance to read the book, that would be great. If you get a chance to be one of those people, that would be even better. Thank you very much. Okay. So I think we have some time for questions or comments or thoughts, or just bringing up a surface for me to play with.
Have you thought at all about the forces that drive these social networks? Are there sort of like supply and demand kind of analogies?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. I mean, why people get involved, right? What is it, in some of the cases, one thing I didn't talk about, for instance, in the book is there's a whole chapter on prize-backed challenges, prizes. An incredible mechanism for these kinds of things, whether it's X Prizes, whether it's the premiums of the Royal Society of the Arts, which were a big part of innovation and the Enlightenment, where you create some kind of prize, and whether it's coming from a philanthropic organization or a government or a corporation like the Netflix algorithm, and it's a great example of peer networks because what a prize does, like the Longitude Prize was a great example of this. What a prize does is that it, with economic reward, it creates a new pool of people who are kind of thinking about a problem, trying to solve it. But a lot of the prizes, the best prizes, have a condition of kind of openness and non-ownership if you win the prize. So the RSA in the early days of Enlightenment gave away, in today's money, millions and millions of dollars to encourage all sorts of important problems in engineering and technology and so on, and agriculture in 18th century England. And the deal was, if you won the prize, you could not patent your creation. So you created a system that was basically funding things that the market wasn't quite yet ready to fund. But you ensured that, so you brought a lot of new minds to solving this problem. You diversified the network of people trying to solve the problem. But once the problem was solved, the idea itself, the solution, was free to circulate and other people could build on it. So you created a network of people building on it. So in that instance, you have economic rewards concentrating and motivating people. But it's not a traditional kind of marketplace in the way that we normally talk about it. In other cases, I mean, the whole mystery of why Wikipedia works, right? Why do people spend, it's not even, we talk a lot about kind of social prestige, right? That people will do amazing things just to see have their friends see them doing it. And that is an incredibly important, part of our growing understanding of kind of neuroeconomics, that people aren't just rational economic actors, that they have all these kind of social biases built into their decision making. But we all know what Wikipedia is like. It's really hard to tell who wrote what on Wikipedia. I mean, it's not like they're pictures of people saying like, I've written over 3% of this entry on Charles Dickens. Here's my picture, ladies. I mean, it's not part of the reward, right? And so why do they do it? It's a really interesting thing. And I think there are all these mechanisms that vary, I think, from site to site. Kickstarter, I think, does use social prestige, for instance. People do like to tweet about the thing they backed on Kickstarter, and so that's part of it. And the rewards are another kind of motivating factor. On Wikipedia, there's not that. But there are other mechanisms. Wikipedia, one very powerful thing that Wikipedia does that I think should be studied more is the convention of the stub on Wikipedia, right? So and Wikipedia has always had this thing where you create a stub of an entry that says, there is no entry for prize-back challenges, but there should be. And that creates this little flag in the ground saying there's a hole here. Could somebody fill it? I personally can't fill it, or I have a day job, so I don't have time to fill it, or I'm not a loser who goes around filling out Wikipedia entries. But I'm smart enough to know that there is this hole that needs to be filled. And then there are people who just sit there and watch the stubs come in, and they're like, I know something about prize-back challenges. I'm going to fill it. And think about that imagine that in a community with Wikipedia stubs and Kickstarter as a crowdfunding mechanism. So the community is saying, here's a stub here. Here's an empty lot that needs to be filled with something. Literally an empty lot, an abandoned lot. So here's a stub that we plant here that we say, something needs to be done about this. And they're reporting it maybe via a 311 kind of system. And they're doing it because they want to see it filled. Their motivation is, I live across the street from that empty lot, and it's filled with beer cans, or it's filled with kids smoking pot, or whatever it is that it's being filled with. And so they create the stub, and then there's a mechanism whereby people, Kickstarter style, can propose solutions to that problem, propose kind of ways to fill the empty lot. And then there's a mechanism for people to crowdfund those solutions, to decide on which solution to take, because it gets the most funding. And in fact, there are a lot of projects that are, there are things like Neighborly and Neighborland, some extent SeeClickFix, that are out there right now trying to build that kind of model. So in that case, you would have layers of motivation. Like, it's in my backyard, so I want to see it fixed. I actually, build community gardens for a living, and so I would like to fix it because I probably would get paid. And then the funders are contributing because maybe there's social prestige and because they also want to see it fixed. But each network is going to have different kinds of motivations, and I think we have there's a lot to be studied on what motivates them. But I think those are some of them. I could keep answering that forever, but I won't. Okay, yes. You.
Where do you think vouchers fit into this? Because, you mentioned the New York Times and the NEA. It occurred to me as you were saying that the New York Times should have suggested that the NEA be replaced by a voucher system where you can spend your voucher on Kickstarter.
It's really interesting.
It's also similar to the, I forget what you called it, the neighborhood system.
Yeah.
Where, instead of everybody showing up and voting, in a council, maybe they should just, go up and drop their token in saying, I vote for filling the potholes, or I want a neighborhood park, spend my money on that.
It's a fascinating question. And one of the funny things that happened with this book is that I'd spent all this time right before it came out trying to get the excerpt for the Wall Street Journal kind of through the editorial biases of the Wall Street Journal so that it would run. And so it was kind of arguing with the right in my mind for like a week before the book came out. And then the first thing I did on book tour is that I did a local NPR interview with an NPR station in Baltimore, Maryland. And was the third thing out of the interviewer's mouth was, "It sounds like you might support charter schools. You know, how dare you?" And I was like, oh, wait, I got to argue with the left, too. I got to remember I'm offending everybody here. I can't just... So part of it, I mean, were you talking about school vouchers particularly, or just any kind of vouchers? But yeah. So I think that vouchers, I mean, the one proposal that is fascinating, that's in the book, it's fascinating not because it comes from me, it's one of the other people's other ideas. It comes from Larry Lessig, actually, spent a lot of time here, and this guy, Bruce Ackerman, which is this idea of what they call democracy vouchers in campaign finance reform. So right now, the way that campaigns are financed is in large part a great betrayal of pure progressive values, precisely because you have a tiny sliver of the population that has a disproportionate stake in funding all these things, and particularly now in the age of super PACs, right? So the percentage of the population that have maxed out their campaign donations it makes the 1% look like the proletariat, right? This is the 1% of the 1%, right? And so you have this situation where all this decision making among our leaders are being steered by this tiny part of the population. And so if you believe in diverse decentralized networks, government is not going to work because they're in the kind of the sway of these small number of donors. So the traditional left approach to that would be to say, okay, public funding of the government should take it over, publicly fund, campaigns. You shouldn't, we figure out some constitutional amendment that overturns Citizen United and all these different things, which is really hard to do. And that too kind of offends pure progressive values because then you got big government taking it over. So what Lessig and a few other people have proposed is this idea of democracy vouchers. And the democracy vouchers idea is that you give every citizen $50 worth of vouchers of their tax dollars that they're going to pay, or if they're in the 47%, they get a credit for $50. And they can use those $50 to back any candidate they want, or split between different candidates, or back a party, or if they don't specify it, it'll go to the party that they're aligned with, or if they aren't aligned with the party, it'll go to fund the mechanisms of running campaigns and running the election process, which is expensive. And you can match that with $100 of your own money. And what that would create would be this giant pool of money that any candidate could get access to, that would be pledged to the candidate like they were pledged to a Kickstarter campaign, if they swore off any other traditional private funding. And the premise is, and they've done the math on this, that the pool would be so large that any rational candidate would not want to raise money from additional sources. And so you could get people to kind of go towards this much more diverse, crowd-funded pool of money without a constitutional amendment, without questioning whether campaign finance is free speech and so on. So that's a voucher approach. And I think there's the whole school question is another one. There has to be some kind of diversification and experimentation that happens in the school system. The way it works and the role of traditional kind of top-down teachers' unions in this is a complicated thing. I think that the unions have some issues, but I think they are also sometimes vilified unnecessarily. And the book gets into this in some detail. I don't want to take up too much time on that, but it's an excellent question. Right up front.
A whole bunch of systems and a whole bunch of examples and a whole bunch of things, but I haven't heard anything about a pretty successful one that's been going on for about 25 years down in the desert, Burning Man. Has that on your radar? Have you talked to Larry Harvey? Have you done any research in that?
That's a really good story. And I've never been to Burning Man, but all of my friends, my new friends in California, are such believers in it. And actually, I had this is one of the things about California I love. I had, I don't mean to name drop here, but I had lunch with Stuart Brand in California, and he was saying, have you been to Burning Man? I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, now that you're out here, you really should go, and you really should bring your kids. It's great for kids. And I thought, this is the difference between New York and California. In New York, the 72-year-olds aren't saying, you really should bring your children, your young children to Burning Man, right? That's the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. Yeah, but as a kind of self-organizing gift economy, it's an incredible story. That's a great example, and that has become such a big deal, and seemingly, how the one thing I haven't done in this book, just because I haven't had time and I didn't want to. Again, it's not comprehensive. Is to look at how these things fall apart potentially and how they keep themselves from falling apart. Because Burning Man had this. And it was constantly battling, as far as I understand, from the outside, the kind of destructive success of something like that, where it gets too big for its own good, or it's going to. And city neighborhoods have that problem all the time, right? They self-organize into something that's really great, and then no one can afford to live there anymore, and they kind of implode for all these different reasons. So, networks that figure out a way without traditional leadership or without a real executive authority to nonetheless build up these interesting forms of exchange, and then stay somehow balanced. How they do that is one of the things we're going to have to study. I don't know enough about it to have all the answers, but it's a great example. All right, I'll add that to my repertoire. Thank you for that. It is a whole. All right, anything else, or should we go and sign books? And you can sign the books, or I'll sign them, whichever you want. All right, thanks guys for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you.